I'm going to call this Psychoanalysis as Deconstruction Part 2. I realized that I had left out a number of clinical illustrations to bring home the wider point that I was trying to make in the previous video. Um, I'm talking about the analysis of such phenomena as envy and aggression. Let's start with envy. Of course, there's the famous penis envy, which Freud never attributed to all women, but only to those particular women um, who felt that the absence of a penis represented for them a castration. Now, Freud wrote about this in a way that reflected his own sexism. He would say that when the girl discovers she lacks a penis, no problem with that. Girls do make that discovery. But then he immediately says, when she thus discovers her castration, there is where his sexism is revealed, because lacking a penis is not in any way a castration. A female is not castrated. She does lack a penis. That's probably also problematic to say she lacks a penis. Um, she doesn't have a penis. Is that a lack? My point is that certainly some women do recognize themselves or define themselves as lacking. Of course, many men also define themselves as fundamentally lacking, inadequate, deficient, defective. So all of the behaviors, the problematic behaviors that come from penis envy, uh, envy itself of any kind, is grounded in a fundamental fantasy of lack. So if a therapist or an analyst works to help a person manage their envy, to try to defend against it, or to modify it, or to control it in some way, if they don't get down to the fantasy that underlies the envy, the fundamental fantasy of lack, then the problem is never solved. Because the key problem is not the envy. The key problem is the definition of the self as lacking. That is the problem. And that is what needs to be analyzed. Now, of course, one of the big problems in Lacanian theory is that there is a very fundamental sense, says Lacan, of lack, manquer à être, at the core of human being. To be human is to suffer from this sense of lack. And of course, this is fundamentally incorrect. That sense of lack is not an existential necessity, as Lacan seems to rationalize it and justify it. The sense of lack is a fantasy, PH fantasy, that has been concretized and literalized and taken for granted. And this fundamental definition of the self as lacking leads to all kinds of trouble, all kinds of longing, all kinds of resentment, all kinds of questing. Okay, so similarly with aggression, um, we discover the patient's hostility, and we help the patient try to manage their hostility, to sublimate their hostility, whatever. But we often fail to get at the fundamental definition of the situation, the fantasy that generates the aggression. I well remember Charles Brenner standing at the Waldorf when his book, The Mind in Conflict, was being discussed, and he defined the goal of psychoanalysis as helping people exchange maladaptive defenses for more adaptive defenses, um, replacing defenses that were costing too much in terms of sacrifice of pleasure, inhibition, whatever, for better defenses that were less costly in these ways. And someone asked, might have been me, is that really the best we can do? Exchange maladaptive for more adaptive defenses? How about changing what the defenses are defending against? And he thought that that was absurd and impossible. Take, for example, the Oedipal conflicts between a father and a son. The son's Oedipal hostility towards the father as a rival. All we can do is manage that. That's an inevitable feeling, impulse. Human beings are stuck with that. They're stuck with the id. All we can do is manage it better, perhaps a bit more creatively if we have some talent. But we can't fundamentally change the id. It's a given for classical Freudians and for classical ego psychologists, certainly for Brenner. No, the son's hostility towards the father cannot be eliminated. It can only be better managed. Well, that's false. Of course, the son's hostility can be eliminated in some, perhaps even many cases, because the son's hostility is grounded in a fantasy very often. The fantasy that the father is intentionally oppressing him, depriving him, castrating him. Very often, it turns out it's the son who is castrating, and he's projecting his own envious and castrating impulses towards the father onto the father and seeing the father as castrating. I mean, I'm not denying there are castrating fathers, for sure, but there are castrative sons who out of envy wish to Jack the Giant Killer. He goes up the beanstalk to steal the giant's hen that lays the golden eggs and harp and what else? I forget what the third thing is. The son is a thief. He envies the giant father's possessions and capabilities and wishes to steal them. He also wishes to steal the giant's wife. When he's running from the giant, the wife lets him hide in her oven. Okay. So sometimes the son's feeling like a lack causes him to envy and be aggressive and competitive towards the father. Sometimes that's projected and the father is seen as aggressive and castrating. The son's aggression is grounded in his feeling of lack. If his feeling of lack, if his fantasy of lack is overcome, so is the aggression that flows from it. What kinds of destructive things flow from feeling one is lacking? Envy flows from feeling one is lacking. It's not helpful for Lacan to go all existential and talk about how a sense of lack is at the core of human being in the world. No, that is not a psychoanalytic perspective. The psychoanalytic perspective is seeking to delineate the core fantasy that gives rise to all of the trouble, the envy, the aggression, whatever. very often grounded in fantasy. Now, I don't mean that everything is fantasy. There is trauma. There is injustice. Um, these things are real, but human beings don't live entirely in reality. They also live in the imaginary. Um, uh, and very often, the real trauma is greatly enhanced in imagination. The real injustice is sometimes exaggerated, universalized. Um, Sometimes we see the cup as half empty. Other times we see it as half full. Um, Sometimes we only see the vase. At other times we see the two faces. But if we can only see the vase, we have a very limited vision. We also have to see the two faces in the classic Gestalt illustration. So, in psychoanalysis, we need to come to understand the patient's fundamental vision of the self, of life, and of other people, because very often the phenomena that we work with, like aggression, like envy, like depression, like mania, all of the kinds of psychopathological states and behaviors that we deal with are grounded in or derived from a core fantasy, which is often very one-sided, but which is totalized and gives rise to a lot of problems. So, psychoanalysis as deconstruction.